Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner. I'm here once again with one of our favourite creators, Joshua Williamson. How are you, mate?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good, good,
And
good, good.
you're with us to talk about a couple of things, with me to talk about a couple of things today. The first of which is your upcoming book, Rogues, which is available for pre-order from the links attached to our conversation. What can you tell me about it, brother?
Well, it's a Black Label 4-issue miniseries that I'm doing with DC Comics. It's being drawn by Leo Max, who had done Basket Full of Heads with Joe Hill.
Yeah.
And it is a crime book in the DCU starring the Rogues. It's about their kind of one last heist that they're going to go on. It doesn't take place in continuity, but I'm a continuity junkie, so I definitely borrow from a lot of stuff and kind of pick and choose what I wanted to do. But it takes place 10 years in the future after the Rogues have disbanded, and Captain Cold is like, you know what? There's one last heist we can do. There's one last thing we can do, and they go to do this heist. And part of the story is that they've tried to walk the line, right? They've tried to reform. Like Captain Cold is in parole. They're all on parole, really. They're all in kind of these like different stages of their lives. They haven't been together in a while, and Captain Cold goes try to pull them back together for this one last heist.
And is this a pantheon of characters that you've always been a fan of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm been obviously a big fan of the Flash. I spent a lot of time on it, and I always liked working with the Rogues. This story actually was something I pitched back in 2016. It was going to be I had pitched this idea for one of the Rogue stories, and we all liked it. We all talked about it a lot, but there was a problem. Like every time we talked about it, it was like, this is a Rogue story, not a Flash story. And when we had just, when I first started working on Flash, it was during Rebirth. Everything was about getting everything back to its core and back to its baseline. And so with Rogues, the idea was like, how is this a Flash story? That was part of the problem. And then it was like, is this the kind of story, when we're reintroducing the Rogues at that time, is this the kind of story that fits with it? And the answer was no. And so I was like, all right, well, let's put that on the back burner. I'll never get back to it. Well, then back in like the spring of 2020, one of the editors at DC reached out to me and they said like, hey, would you ever want to do that? Would you ever want to come back and do that Rogue story? And at first I wasn't sure, because this was literally when I was wrapping up on Flash. Like I was ending Flash, and so I was like, oh, I want to just jump back in. And then we started talking about it more, and it was like, oh no, we do it a Black Label, it'll be completely different. And the Flash doesn't appear once in the entire story. It's all about them. I don't even think he's ever even mentioned. I think he's very lightly mentioned, but it's not about him, it's about them. And so it really became this like dream project, and it was something so different than anything else I had done at DC. I think it's a little bit closer in tone to things like Ghosted and Birthright and Nailbiter. It's something very different from all the superhero stuff I've done. And when I remember reading Basket Full of Heads #1 and just immediately being like in love with Leo Max art, just right there, like that first issue. I remember getting the last page and being like, this dude can draw. Like this is really, really good. And so when he came up in conversations at DC, I was like, he'd be perfect for this, but I don't know if he'd be interested. And they sent him the pitch, not even the first issue, because I hadn't written it yet. They sent him the pitch, and he was like, I want to do this. Just started designing characters, and he really got into it, and has been a dream to work with. I mean, he's very creative, very thoughtful, does amazing work on the pages.
Where I thought The Flash was always, as a book, ahead of its time, and I thought this when I was a kid, is that it had the definable name for its pantheon of villains, the Rogues Gallery,
Yeah.
and but also it had there was a consciousness of the Flash Rogues in the way that there would come to be of the Bat villains in a later era, but it was the Flash villains were kind of branded as this team of oddball villains. When did you first encounter that yourself, mate?
Oh man, I think it's so fascinating. I think about this a lot about the Rogues, and I think it's one of the challenges of them as characters is that you're, like you just said, it's like you know, Batman has this rogues gallery who do work with each other, but they're not necessarily associated to the point where it's like, if you see one, that means you see all of them, right? Like, if you see a Mr. Freeze story, that doesn't automatically guarantee like the Joker and Scarecrow is going to show up, right? But when you're doing a Flash story, you can't, it's very challenging to be like, it's only Captain Cold, because people will automatically assume the rest of them are going to go show up.
Yeah.
And for me, like, I've always known them as this, like, they're just a team, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember, you know, Mark Waid didn't really use the Rogues very much, but Jeff did, you know. And
Yeah.
Jeff obviously loves the Rogues and loves Captain Cold a lot and has put a lot of work into them. So that's a lot of my thoughts on the Rogues come from that. But then I went back and I was reading all these, when I was working on Flash, it was like, I already read everything, but working on Flash, I was constantly going back and rereading back issues and constantly rereading the history of these characters. And so the Rogues have just always been this group to me. And I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts on their relationship and how they are as this kind of family unit. You know, they're not just like a regular team, right? They're just not like a team of hoods that are just like, we're going to get together and we're going to rob this place. It's like everything about them is kind of this family relationship. And so it just makes them kind of an interesting group to write, especially with Captain Cold and his sister, Lisa, who is Golden Glider.
Yeah.
And just writing all this stuff with them and how they kind of go back and forth on, you know, it's interesting. They don't see themselves as supervillains.
Yeah.
Right? They're not heroes. They're not villains. They're just out for money. They're just out to lead a better life for themselves, you know? Like, I think Captain Cold particularly doesn't want to be his father, and he doesn't want to be a loser, and what he sees as a loser. So everything he does is about that. But he just happens to be good at this one thing.
Yeah.
You know? And that's something what we deal with in the book is that, like, you know, what do you do when the only thing you're good at is crime? Right? So it's like, you can try to have a regular job, but it still gets under your skin, you know, and that's part of what we see in the issue.
I think that's such an interesting approach because, you know, it speaks to me in part of say the whole Ocean's 11 franchise / universe, or Michael Mann's Heat, where you're dealing with people who are high level professionals at what they do, but they wouldn't describe themselves as bad per se. They don't define themselves as villains. And I think what you're saying is applying that very interesting school of thought, but to, you know, the Flash gallery of villains, the Flash gallery of rogues.
Yeah, I think just that they're just going to work.
Yeah,
like, I mean, that's what it is, you know. And in this case, with this has been fun because I got to have a lot of cameos from different characters. It is not the rogues group that you're normally used to because, like I said, it's 10 years in the future, so some of them are dead, you know. So that's a part of the story, is like they having to recruit new people or people you wouldn't expect to necessarily be with the rogues. And the whole thing is like they're going to go to Gorilla City to rip off Gorilla Grodd, and that's extremely dangerous. And you find out what's been going on with Grodd as well in the last 10 years and who Grodd really is. And, you know, we get to have this insight to a certain side of Grodd in Gorilla City we've seen before. And that was all that's been really fun. But at the end of the day, it's just this like neo-noir crime story. You know, it's very dirty. It's very hard. It is, I think it is fun, but in the way that something like Michael Mann's Heat is fun. you know?
Right on.
You know,
mate, you're pressing all my buttons with this description. And I think the other thing that you're touching upon that I really respond to is another area I think in which the Flash was way ahead of its time, was in its sense of family and dynasty. So the Flash has always been a book about generations of a particular hero. And outside of, say, James Robinson's Starman, I can't really think of a group of characters that have ever really been analysed and presented that way with a real deep dive. And it seems to me you're getting to take out the rogues element of the Flash and do that for the Flash, which is something that's just so in keeping with the ethos of the character and the family of characters within those books over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what was interesting about, you know, Cold and Flash's relationship is they're both family people, right? Like they just have very different views on it. You know, I wrote an issue where Captain Cold and Barry were in a prison transport together, and they talked about this, and they talked about how Barry was like, you know, they both have this view of taking care of their families. They just have very different ways of doing it. And so with this, just getting to focus on just the rogue side of things, and it's going to tell, you know, again, it's different from anything else I've done for DC, and just getting to do a crime story in the DCU was really fun. I worked on it a long time ago, so it's crazy it's coming out now. There's a part of me that was like, is this ever going to come out? Because we were just really making sure we put a lot of work into it. Like it was easily, I think, the hardest thing it's ever been to write for me at DC. So I took time writing it, and the stuff that Leo Max has been doing are really detailed and beautiful pages. And so it just really like we really put a lot of thought and care into this book, and it took time. So now we finally get to show it to people. It's really cool.
Mate, I can't wait. And once again, everybody watching this and getting as excited as I'm about this can pre-order Rogues issue 1 from the links attached to our conversation. And before you go, Josh, there's another book that is going to be available in the links here, and that's the collected edition of your arc on Future State Gotham. So, what can you tell everybody watching here about that book?
Well, Future State Gotham, it spun out of the two-part Red Hood story I did at Future State. And DC came to me and they're like, well, do you want to continue that story? Because we were just having fun doing it, And they were like, we want to do it as a black and white kind of thing and make it a little raw and dirty. And I was like, I'm not sure I have time. Like I'm always doing so much. And so I started asking questions about it. And I was like, well, can I bring in someone I know who's written books for Image and Dark Horse and has relationships at DC? And it was Dennis Culver. And he has a lot of thoughts on Red Hood, and he was enjoying Future State. So I was able to bring him in. And so the two of us were able to just craft like the continuing adventures of Jason Todd in the future, and getting to show him interact with Chase, with Batman. DC wanted to make sure we, try to find ways to bring in all the Future State stuff and try to just kind of, tell a cool story about hunting Batman. I mean, that's really what it came down to, was Jason Todd getting the job to try to hunt Batman down. And so Dennis and I, and working with DC, were able to craft this story. And Giannis, who had drawn the two parts with me before, he came back to do this opening act. And it's been really fun working on it. Like just doing this kind of, because interesting, it's just like how Rogues was, right? Where it's like out of continuity, so you can get a little bit different with it. You can kind of, tell your own story. And so with this, we're able to just kind of get a little bit grittier with it than we normally would. And I've always liked Jason Todd, so getting to do more stories with him. And I'd written Jace also in the Future State Justice League story, so I get to bring him in. It was just like, I don't know, it's kind of just a very fun experience working on that book. And then I left that book at issue 7, which is the wrap up of the first arc. And then Dennis took over and did the next Joker storyline. But yeah, that first trade is really cool. It also collects everything. Like it collects the 2 parts from the Future State Dark Detective stuff, and then you take that plus the 7 issues that I did, and you get to have this really cool collection that really sets up and continues this Future State world that we're playing in.
Lovely. And what do you think it is about Jason Todd that has made the character in his current incarnation cut through so massively with both like creators and fans alike?
I think because he's not perfect. He's not like the golden boy, in a lot of ways. Like I think that Dick Grayson is seen as kind of again, like the golden prodigal child, right? Like he's held to a certain standard, and you have Tim Drake, which is like I've talked about this in other books I've written, where it's like Tim Drake is a really smart one, and Damian is this badass, like no nonsense character. And I think people relate to Jason Todd's flaws, and I think they relate to this is not easy for him, and there's a struggle there to who he is and what he's gone through. In a lot of ways, I think it does make him more relatable, and then you also kind of like want him to succeed, right? Like he's the underdog, so you're constantly like you root for him, and because you take all that and he's like the bad boy of the group, it's the same thing of like I know that when James was doing the Batman Ninja Turtles stuff, you had to break up who was who, right? And it was like Jason Todd is clearly Raphael, and I feel like it's that same energy, So I think that really it appeals to people, and I think for me, the idea of him kind of being, he was like the reject, he was the bad kid, and I think a lot of that stuff you kind of again you start rooting for him, and it makes him a more complicated character. I mean, all the other Robins are very complicated, when you have like Dick and Steph and Tim and Damian, but I think there's just something about the fact that we've seen Jason fall farther than any other Robin has, and and then forcibly pulled back, and you get to see those struggles that he has, and it's not easy for him.
Now, I think it's an interesting turn in the DC universe over the last like 2 decades or so. Because when I was a
Yeah,
kid, first reading my Batman comics, there's one Robin, and
yeah,
sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't. And I'd never thought at the point that I grew up in the early 70s, where he's packed off to college, and
yeah.
you don't really want to see him.
Uh-huh.
A future world in which there's not just one Robin, there are four of them. There's a whole pantheon of Robins. I think it's quite an amazing thing. You know what I mean?
I do too. I love that stuff. I think it's one of my favorite parts of DC, and this is something I will probably talk about a lot this year, is the idea that these growing families of the DCU, and I think there's a lot of cool stuff to that idea that all of these families keep growing, and they
Yeah,
keep expanding. I like it a lot. I think it's, I don't know, there's something very powerful to it and very DC.
yeah,
I think it's a
yeah.
very DC thing to do at this point, to continue to grow these families.
I think it's a beautiful thing actually, and I think the reason for that is, again, as an old time comics fan, somebody who's read comic books since I was 3, right? No doubt, like yourself, since a very early age. A fundamental trope within comic books was the orphan, the hero as orphan, right? And so a
Oh yeah.
fundamental part of comic book origins for decades was the fact that these men and women were completely isolated and alone. And we now live in a world where the concept of family is being embraced within comic book
Oh yeah.
superhero narratives. I find that
Yeah.
fascinating. I'm very
Yeah.
satisfying.
Me too. I mean, I think the idea that Batman, there's a part of Batman that we all still associate him as this like loner, but he has the biggest family in comics.
It really does.
Right? Well, it's the same thing. Wolverine, like Wolverine is constantly surrounding himself with people and taking people on and training
Yeah.
them, and we maintain this illusion that like, oh, they're loners, and it's like, what are you talking about? Like Bruce Wayne has a mansion full of people who live there now at this
Yeah,
point.
that's
So
right. It's so
like
true.
there's not an empty room in Wayne Mansion anymore. you know? So I think, but I like that stuff. I've always gravitated toward it, and maybe it has something to do with when I was really starting to read, where it's like, I'm starting to really start reading in the late 80s or late 90s, and it's like there were all of these entry points for me. It's like, um, for almost all of the families had a new character introduced around the same time. So you had like Tim Drake, you had Connor, Superboy, and you had Bart was Impulse, and you had Cassie, and as Wonder Girl. So all of these, all of the major groups were introducing these new characters, and even something with like Green Lantern, you had Kyle was introduced, right? And so it was all of these entry points to me. And so for me, like I've always kind of seen DC as this way of introducing these new characters as windows into the bigger world. And it's just part of what I think DC is. I think it's that way for a long time. I mean, it's literally part of why Robin was created in the first place, was they wanted something that kids could relate to. I mean, it's to me, it's so much a part of the DNA of DC Comics, is to introduce these newer or younger characters as a point of view to the other ones, right? I think that Supergirl was created, all these things were created for those reasons. But really getting back down to just Dick Grayson was introduced because they wanted a kid there, so the kids could be like, that's me, I'm teaming with Batman,
Yeah.
like, and I think we still have that. It's just we gotta find places for it. But it's part of why I love, when I love DC Comics, a big piece of what makes DC Comics special are the sidekicks and the legacies and the family.
I couldn't agree more. I really think that's extremely well said. What was it, Robin, the sensation of 1940? I think that's the original
Yeah,
Robin cover. He's bursting through the drum, the circus
yeah,
drum. It's absolutely well said. And I think the fact that you're getting to play around with all of this, and I've had just this amazing run over the last couple of years. It's a joy to be able to read it, and the people watching this conversation, Rogues #1 and Future State Gotham can actually be ordered from the links attached to our conversation. Thanks for dropping in, Josh. It's great to see you,
yeah. No
mate.
problem. Thank you. You guys, you too.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.